Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to come to this wonderful event. And if you are still coming in, just feel free to come in and just take a seat anywhere. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you to the Fall 2024 Dean's Distinguished Lecture. In a few moments, we're going to have the pleasure of hearing from Diana O'Brien, the Bela Kornitzer Distinguished Professor in the Department of Political Science, as she speaks about the causes and consequences of women's political representation. Incredibly timely. I'm really looking forward to this whole talk. After the presentation, we'll have time for a few questions, and Diana will be moderating that herself. And then after that, we invite you to join us for a reception here just outside the auditorium in Frick Forum, so I hope that you can all stay for that. If you have not already done so, this is a great moment to take out and silence your phone. And now I'm going to turn to introducing our dean and the host of today's event, Feng-Sheng Hu, the Richard G. Engelsman Dean of Arts and Sciences, and the Lucille P. Markey Distinguished Professor in Biology and Earth and Environmental and Planetary Sciences. Since arriving here at WashU in July 2020, Dean Hu has focused on implementing a bold strategic plan for the future of arts and sciences. Since the plan's launch, Arts and Sciences has recruited a large number of outstanding scholars to join its faculty, including Diana O'Brien. Under Dean Hu's leadership, Arts and Sciences has also set a record for external grant funding and developed signature initiatives to spark convergent and innovative research and education. And now, please join me in welcoming Dean Hu.
Good afternoon. It's great to see all of you. Thank you so much for joining us for this important and timely event. As Eva said, I'm Feng-Sheng Hu, the Richard G. Engelsman Dean of Arts and Sciences. I am delighted to welcome you to the Dean's Distinguished Lecture today. This lecture series was created last year, and it offers an opportunity for the campus and community to learn from some of the brightest minds in arts and sciences. Today's event is the second in this series, and I hope you will continue to join us for more talks in the future. As some of you know, we are now a couple of years into what we call the Decade of Arts and Sciences, a period of significant growth designed to establish our school as a global model for research, education, and scholarship. A key component of our 10-year strategic vision involves bringing our talented faculty into the spotlight to showcase their vast and varied expertise. As I thought about potential speakers for today's lecture, which I knew would happen in the home stretch of a historic presidential election, one name repeatedly came to my mind, and it is Professor Diana O'Brien. Diana is the Bela Kornitzer Distinguished Professor and a leading scholar on gender and politics, a key member of our world-class Department of Political Science. She studies the causes and consequences of women's political representation with a focus on advanced democracies. Her research explores the barriers that exclude women from office and investigates how women gain access to political posts traditionally dominated by men. Diana's studies have found that electing women to political office affects policy outcomes and changes citizens' perceptions of politics. In a world of increasing political polarization, understanding these issues is of the utmost importance. With research that spans the globe, it should be no surprise to anybody that Diana is held in high esteem around the world. She is a celebrated writer, sought-after speaker, and the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships. Her insights have been showcased in the top political science journals, News coverage of her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Guardian, Newsweek, and many, many international outlets. While these individual achievements are certainly very impressive, I have also been inspired by the many ways Diana has elevated an entire community of scholars dedicated to gender and politics. In January this year, she led the inaugural Bela Kornitzer Research Symposium here at WashU. This inspiring event brought together students, faculty, staff, supporters, and scholars from all over the world to discuss cutting-edge political science topics, including war and democracy, political communication, and more. I'm proud to say that Diana is one of our own products. She earned her PhD here at WashU in 2012. And I'm so pleased to say that she decided to return to WashU 10 years later in 2022, after holding faculty positions at 4 other institutions: USC, Indiana, Texas A&M, and Rice. You can see how marketable Diana is. She basically writes her own ticket anywhere she wants to go. So we are just so lucky to have her here. And you all know that our Department of Political Science is one of the best in the nation, and its outstanding reputation is the result of our talented faculty, such as Diana, collaborating across disciplines to push the boundaries of scholarly inquiry. Without further ado, please now join me in welcoming Professor Diana O'Brien to the podium.
Thank you, Dean Hu, for that generous introduction, and to everybody in the Dean's Office in Arts and Sciences for giving me this platform and helping make this event happen. Thank you to all of you for sharing your time with me today, even if it's just in an effort to make the emails stop, right? I know how valuable your time is, and I'm so grateful for it. So the title of the talk, as publicized, is Causes and Consequences of Women's Political Representation. And that's an appropriate title because those 7 words really encapsulate what I've been doing for the past 18 years. So I showed up on WashU's campus as a 21-year-old PhD student back in 2006. I think in this building when it was Elliott Hall. I think right here. It's very surreal for me to be up here. So I showed up here with the intention of studying the causes and consequences of women's political representation. Now, 12 or so years after I graduated, I have the greatest job in the world. I get to spend my days thinking about women's political representation. I get to generate new knowledge on a topic that is profoundly and personally important to me. I get to help other students and future scholars work in this area, and I get to share that knowledge with others, including you here today. And perhaps most importantly, I'm able to get people excited about understanding and improving women's place in politics. And so if I thought I could have gotten away with more words and more exclamation points, I would have called this talk, Where Are All the Women? Understanding Women's Exclusion from Politics, Why It Matters, and What We Can Do About It. Because that's precisely the conversation that we're going to have here today. Okay, so our starting point is also the starting point of my work, which is to acknowledge men's dominance in politics. So let's begin with the USA. So men are a little under 50% of the American population, and an even smaller percentage of registered voters. Yet, men dominate American politics. So if we start at the bottom of the graph, we can see that 2/3 of state legislators and municipal office holders are men. 72% of members of Congress are men, if we work our way up. Over 3/4 of mayors and governors are men. And of course, all US presidents to date have been men. Men, I want to point out, are especially overrepresented in Missouri politics. So the dark blue line is Missouri. So you can see that 71% of Missouri state legislators are men, and 80, soon to be 90% of our congressional delegation are men. So this is not just an American problem. Women's underrepresentation in politics is a global phenomenon. So this is data compiled with support from the National Science Foundation of women's representation over time and across all countries in the world. So as you can see, women are significantly underrepresented in national level politics, and their underrepresentation becomes more acute as we move into more and more powerful positions. So in 2024, women are 27% of legislators worldwide. They hold 23% of cabinet posts. They make up only around 8.5% of the world's presidents and prime ministers. So data like this is what gets me to campus every morning. Because when I see a figure like this, I have to know. Why are women underrepresented in politics? What are the consequences of women's underrepresentation? And how can we elect more women to office? So let's start at the beginning. Why are women underrepresented in politics? A large part of my career has been dedicated to understanding when women are able to access political office and the factors that keep them out. There are many barriers to women's equal representation in politics, including women having few of the resources that they need to contest political office, exposure to gendered hostility and even violence when campaigning, stereotypes about women's issue competencies, and male gatekeepers limiting women's candidacies. So there's a huge body of literature on this. And within that, we typically think of these factors as falling under two categories. So first, supply. Are well-qualified women willing and able to pursue political office? And then demand. Are voters and political insiders willing to support women's candidacies? So let's think together about supply. So there are a number of factors that shape women's willingness to come forward. Among the most frequently studied, particularly in the US, is political ambition. So I want to start by thinking about what is political ambition. So when we're thinking about political ambition, we're just asking ordinary Americans, have you ever considered running for office? So take a moment, think for yourself. How ambitious are you? So I have data here, and one of my co-authors is in the audience, from a Wiedenbaum Center funded study on ambition among ordinary Americans. So this is a nationally representative sample that actually also oversamples Black and Hispanic Americans. Okay, so our men are in blue and our women are in orange, broken out by race and ethnicity on the horizontal axis. So what we can see is that American men are significantly more likely to consider running for office. So here, I'm just plotting on the vertical axis the predicted probability that my respondents have considered running for any office. And what you can see is that men, and white men in particular, express more political ambition than women. It's not just that men are more likely to have considered running for office, it's also that men are much more confident in their qualifications to do so. So we also ask respondents, are you qualified to hold elected office? And so now on the vertical axis, I'm just showing you the predicted number of offices that men and women think they're qualified to hold. What you can see is that men consistently report that they're qualified to hold more offices than women. In fact, some of our men are really confident about their qualifications. So we did ask them, are you qualified to be president of the United States of America? And so here on the vertical axis, you can see the proportion of men who reply that, yes, I can do it. Lead the free world. And what you can see is across these groups, between 14 and 20% of men are ready to lead us. They're ready to be president of the United States. Women, a little more muted, perhaps realistic, about their qualifications. So obviously, when I see data like this, it raises a question of, why is it that men are so much more ambitious than women, right? So it's my expectation that in part because men have dominated politics and the public sphere for so long. There are just many implicit and explicit signals in the political culture that signal that politics is a place where men belong, right? So when we think about how we learn about politics in school, how we talk about politics, politics is often portrayed as an environment where great men do great things, right? And women are absent from those narratives. So, drawing on that, it is my expectation that thinking about male political greatness bolsters men's political ambition in particular. So when you're a social scientist and you have an intuition like this, what you do is you turn it into a falsifiable hypothesis and you run an experiment. That is what makes us so much fun at parties, right? So my co-authors and I decided to randomly assign a nationally representative sample of American men and women to one of 3 almost identical 2-minute civics lessons. So the content of these lessons is the same, but the first civics lesson uses imagery from the Founding Fathers. The second includes images of prominent women from history, and the third just focuses on historic documents. So what do we find? So on the horizontal axis here, I have my 3 groups, my groups that see the Founding Fathers condition, the historic documents, and the inclusive founders. On the vertical axis, an ambition score. So higher values mean that my respondents report more ambition. On the left, I have my men respondents. On the right, my women. And so what you can see is that even just a 2-minute civics video talking about the Founding Fathers, framing the Founding Fathers, leads men to report significantly more political ambition than the other conditions. And we do not find similar effects for women. So for me, this experiment tries to speak to a larger political environment where we're often taking cues, both subtle and more explicit, about men's political greatness, right? Whether that's Broadway shows or images on the money we spend or the names of the universities that we work and study in. Right? Political culture is coded male in a way that fosters men's political ambition. Okay. So, why are women underrepresented in politics? In part because men are more interested in running for office than women, right? And that's because we're in a political environment that perhaps fosters men's ambition. But in addition to supply, we also need to think about demand. So are voters and political insiders biased against women's candidacy? So here I want to start by thinking about voter bias. Right? So to begin, this is data from the most recent World Values Survey. On the horizontal axis, I have all of the countries in the World Values Survey. On the vertical axis, I have the percentage of respondents in those countries that agree or strongly agree that men make better political leaders than women. So from this global snapshot, you can see that there's a tremendous amount of variation in voter bias across countries. There are countries where voter bias is quite low and countries where voter bias is quite high. If we look across countries, the average proportion of respondents saying that they agree or strongly agree that men make better political leaders than women is 36%. So Latvia in dark blue is right at the mean. So let's zoom in a little bit so we can understand the data a little better. So we have countries in the world like Iceland, Sweden, New Zealand that have very little voter bias, so only 5% of respondents agree that men make better political leaders than women. And then we have countries like Nigeria, Pakistan, and Egypt, where over 3/4 of respondents agree that men are better political leaders. Globally, you can see that comparatively, the US does well on this measure. So presently, 16% of Americans are willing to tell a surveyor that they agree that men are better political leaders than women. So that is a shrinking but non-trivial number of Americans that express outright bias against women in politics. So in addition to outright bias, the success or failure of women candidates is also shaped by voter stereotypes about men's and women's traits and issue competencies. So for example, looking across countries and over time, women are especially unlikely to be appointed to Homeland Security posts following terror attacks. And in an experiment with American respondents, I find that Americans prefer a man to be appointed to lead Homeland Security when they're primed to think about terror. And that's especially true for my men respondents. They really prefer men's leadership in these moments. But this gendered lens through which we can view candidates does not uniformly disadvantage women. So, for example, women's leadership is actually often preferred when we're faced with increases in corruption. Because of stereotypes about women being more honest and more trustworthy, because women are often perceived to be political outsiders, voters actually like to have women in these moments. So this can cut both ways. Okay. So voter bias matters, but in some ways, demand for political insiders might be as or more important for explaining women's underrepresentation. Okay, so what do I mean by this? So ballot access matters a lot. Once you're on the ballot, you're running under a party label, and even if voters are explicitly biased against women, they might still cast their vote for you because they want to support the party, right? So being on the ballot matters a lot. In many parts of the world, elite support is often a necessary condition for ballot access. In the US, we're actually unusual in that we use primaries to select candidates. In most parts of the world, political parties choose their candidates, right? And so elite support is a necessary condition for women's representation. Even in the US, recruitment from political insiders matters a lot. Citizens report much more ambition if a political actor has asked them to run for office. The support from party insiders is really important for becoming a candidate and then being successful in your primary and perhaps in your general election. So political insiders matter even here. Because politics is so male-dominated, most party insiders are men, and those men often replicate male dominance either intentionally or unintentionally. So there is some explicit bias against women among male political elites, right? They want to hoard political power and all of the resources that come with it for men. In other times, men are not biased against women, may in fact, in the abstract, be supportive of women, but when they're recruiting candidates, they're looking to their own networks. They're looking to their friends, they're looking to their colleagues. And the reality is that men are much more likely to have men in their networks than women. And so men can end up unintentionally replicating male dominance in politics. Okay, so why are women underrepresented in politics? It is a function of both supply, a political environment that encourages more men to run for office, coupled with demand. So in some instances, voters harbor explicit biases against women, and in many cases, view candidates through a gendered lens. And elites also protect the male-dominated status quo, either intentionally or not. Okay, so now that we know why women are underrepresented in politics, let's think about the consequences of that. So I do want to pause here for a moment and say that women's representation is a matter of fairness and justice. This is my 12th year as a gender and politics professor, and no one has ever asked me, why do we need men in political office, right? I have yet to be asked to give a talk on the importance of men's political representation. We do not require men to justify their presence in office, and we should not require women to do so. Women, as citizens, deserve representation, irrespective of outcomes. That being said, it is true that women's representation shapes policy outcomes. So first, we know that women are often more effective policymakers. So in the US, for example, women introduce more legislation, they're better at working alongside other lawmakers, they bring more federal money back to their districts, they respond more and more helpfully to their constituents. So that is not because women are just inherently better lawmakers. It is because of the supply and demand barriers that we just talked about. So because of this male-dominated political environment, the women candidates that emerge are often higher quality. They face elevated voter expectations when campaigning for office, and they're cognizant of that when seeking re-election, right? So the metaphor I always think of here is that Ginger Rogers is absolutely allowed to dance alongside Fred Astaire, just as long as she can do it backwards and in high heels, right? It's not just that women are effective lawmakers. Women also bring unique perspectives to political office. So the reality is, men and women have different life experiences. They have different perspectives on the same life events. They have different social and political networks. And these unique perspectives have consequences for policymaking. So, for example, looking across political parties' policy agendas in established democracies and over time, I find that parties that elect more women are more likely to be issue entrepreneurs. They're more likely to introduce new issues to the policy agenda. They also offer more diverse policy agendas to the electorate. It's also the case that women bring women's interests to the agenda in particular. So I looked at 5 years of legislative speech made by members of Congress on the House floor. I find that women speak more often on behalf of women than do men. We also look at the audio data of those speeches and look at subtle shifts in vocal pitch to capture legislators' emotional intensity when they're talking about different issues. And what we find is that congresswomen speak with intensity when they're talking about women, as compared to when they're talking about other issues, and as compared to congressmen talking on these issues. And so women's representation really matters when policy debates clearly impact women's lives and place in society. Okay, of course, not all women lawmakers act on behalf of women, and some men do. This is not a deterministic relationship at all, but on average, women are more likely to do the work on behalf of women, and that's because these policy issues impact women more, so women have more at stake and more to offer when they're legislating on these issues. Okay, so now you might say, okay, well, what are women's issues? All issues are women's issues, said the gender and politics professor. Even policies that might seem gender neutral often have a gender dimension. So here I want to talk about a policy that's in the news a lot these days, which is tariffs. So tariffs are import taxes. They are taxes on goods imported from other countries, paid by firms, and then passed on to consumers. Tariffs are also central to former President Trump's economic plans for the United States. So we're talking about tariffs a lot these days. So typically when we think about tariffs, we think of them as being a trade-off between domestic producers and consumers. So we can increase tariffs, and that will provide a large competitive advantage for domestic producers, but it will also make goods more expensive for consumers. Or we can decrease tariffs and eliminate that advantage for domestic producers, but also goods will get cheaper for consumers. So I think that you can think about tariffs, of course, as being a trade-off between producers and consumers, but you can also think of tariffs as being redistributive between men and women. Right? And my co-authors and I in particular are interested in how tariffs can be biased against women as both consumers and producers, and importantly, how women's representation can reduce these biases. Okay. So first, let's think about women as consumers. So here I want to think about the pink tax on women's goods. So we use the pink tax to describe the phenomenon of items targeting women consumers as being more expensive than similar items aimed at men consumers. So women pay more for everything from haircuts to dry cleaning to Levi's 501s, right? So the jeans here, men's jeans are going for $68, women's jeans for $88. We assume these price discrepancies either reflect differences in men's and women's products, so maybe those women's jeans are more difficult to produce. My hair is certainly more difficult to style than my lovely husband's, right? And so maybe this is just about different products. Or we assume that women are willing to pay more for items that are specifically targeted at them, right? They want to pay for that pink razor. But it's our contention that actually gender-biased tariffs can play a role in perpetuating the pink tax. So nearly every country in the world uses the same coding system to classify traded goods. So this coding system distinguishes between women's and men's apparel. For example, the same jeans receive different product codes and potentially different tariffs based on whether they're targeted at men or women consumers. What we also discovered is that there's substantial gendered variation in these tariff rates, even within really narrowly defined product categories. So in the US, the tariff rates on men's and women's cotton coats are nearly identical. The tariffs on coats made of man-made fibers are lower for men. The tariffs on coats made of other materials are lower for women. So what did we do? So we looked at the average tariff differential for all products in all countries over time. Right? So here's the map where darker values suggest a greater pink tax on women's items as compared to men's. Lighter values, greater tax on men's items as compared to women's. So looking across countries and over time, we find that the average tariff differential for products that are targeted at women as compared to targeted at men is 0.7%. So women get taxed at 0.7% more than men on identical items. So that might not sound like a lot, but actually, like, those taxes get passed on to wholesalers and then retailers and then consumers and cost women in democracies $15 billion annually. Importantly, women's representation can help ameliorate this pink tax. So we find that countries with greater levels of women's representation actually have lower pink taxes on women's apparel items. So on the horizontal axis, I have the average seat share of women in the legislature, so higher values mean more women. On the vertical axis, the average pink tax, so higher values mean higher pink taxes. And you can see on the left-hand side, when we have very few women in parliament, we also have higher pink taxes. On the right-hand side, when we have more women in parliament, we have lower pink taxes. Okay. So we think that tariffs can be biased against women and consumers, and women's representation can ameliorate that bias. We're also interested in thinking about how tariffs can be biased against women as workers. And our starting point here is to observe that gendered occupational clustering or occupational segregation is a global phenomenon. So globally, we observe that there are occupations that are effectively men only. Like in the United States, you might think about auto machinists or welders, and there are occupations that are effectively women only. That might include like preschool teachers or medical record specialists. So gendered occupational clustering provides the possibility for gendered protectionism. Governments can protect male-dominated industries while leaving women-dominated industries exposed. Right? So what would this look like? We can think about the United States, for example. We think about something like pickup trucks. Pickup trucks are made by machinists who are 95% men, and they enjoy a 25% tariff rate. We can think about linen blazers. Linen blazers are made by sewing machine operators who are 3/4 women, and they have a 3% tariff rate. So there's a reason why you don't see a lot of foreign pickup trucks, but we're all wearing imported blazers, right? It's related to these tariff rates. Okay. So we took data on applied tariffs and matched it to industries. So we have data on the industry tariff rate, right, measured at the industry country year for almost 350 industries across 60 countries over 17 years. What we can see is that across countries, male-dominated industries get more tariff protections. Importantly, tariffs that protect male-dominated industries are also associated with a larger pay gap. So on the horizontal axis here, I have the gender tariff gap. On the vertical axis, the pay gap. So the 0 here would mean parity between men and women. Higher values mean an advantage for men, lower values, an advantage for women. You can see that in countries that have a higher tariff gap, we also see a higher wage gap. Importantly, when women's representation is low, industries with more women receive less trade protection. But when we increase women's representation, it reduces this gendered protectionism, right? So what are the consequences of women's underrepresentation in office? Women's underrepresentation yields worse policy outcomes, especially for women. And I like the tariff example because it shows you the literal cost to women of women's underrepresentation. That pink tax on women's apparel items is costing women $15 billion annually across democracies. Reducing the gender tariff gap by about 1 standard deviation could lower the gender wage gap by about 3 cents on the dollar. Okay. So now that we understand how important women's representation is in office, how can we elect more women? So globally, the answer is gender quotas, right? 93 countries in the world have a legally mandated quota that either requires parties to include women on their list of candidates, that's the countries in yellow, or that reserves seats in the legislature for women. Those are the countries in orange. A number of other countries here in blue rely on voluntary party quotas where political parties set targets for women's representation. Well-designed gender quotas increase women's political representation. So of the top 50 countries in the world that use gender quotas, or that with respect to women's representation, 84% of those countries use gender quotas. In fact, if we look at countries where over 40% of the legislature is women, this becomes especially clear. So there are 3 countries in the world where women actually make up a majority of legislators. That's Rwanda, Cuba, and Nicaragua. There are 4 others where women are at 50%, so Andorra, Mexico, Namibia, and the UAE. So across these countries with 40% women in parliament, 12 of them have a law on the books that requires women's inclusion, and another 11 rely on voluntary party quotas. So well-designed gender quotas increase women's presence in office without compromising the quality of representation. So what do I mean when I say without compromising the quality of representation? So my work and the work of many others suggests that women elected via quotas are as or more qualified for office than their non-quota elected counterparts, and they perform the job as well or better than non-quota elected representatives. That being said, quotas have their detractors. So especially when debating quota adoption, critics often argue that because quotas are anti-meritocratic and illiberal, they degrade democratic legitimacy. So again, when I see a claim like this, I think, testable hypothesis, experiment time. So my co-authors and I have been running experiments across 12 countries with diverse experiences with gender quotas, from the US, where we have effectively no quota, to Mexico, which is a very successful parity quota. We randomly assign nationally representative samples of citizens to read about either an all-male city council, or a gender-equal city council, or a gender-equal city council elected via quotas. And that city council can be discussing either sexual harassment, a clearly gendered issue, or animal mistreatment, nominally not gendered issue. And then we ask respondents, okay, how do you feel about the decision the council reached and its decision-making procedures? So I'm just gonna show you one result. So this is my respondents who read about a council that was discussing sexual harassment, and this is their response to how they feel about the decision-making procedures. Do they trust the council to make the right decision for women? Do they think the decision should be overturned? On the horizontal axis are my 3 treatment conditions, so my all-male council, my gender balance council, and my quota-elected gender balance council. On the vertical axis, my procedural legitimacy score. So higher values mean citizens feel better about the institution. So what you can see, looking across these 12 countries, the most pronounced effect is that people really don't like all-male councils. They really do not like all-male governing institutions. Men's dominance of politics is corrosive for democratic legitimacy. If we compare then the second and third bars, You can see that citizens strongly prefer gender representative bodies, so they prefer women and men to govern together. And actually, the penalty for using a quota policy to get there is pretty minimal, right? So while, yes, citizens prefer gender equality without a quota, they much prefer the use of a quota to an all-male institution. Okay, so how do we get more women to office? Easy, quotas, done, did it. We have 17 minutes left till 5. Great. So actually this Rewire headline comes from this interview I did with a PBS reporter. He's like, how do we get more women? And I said, no problem. Each state has 2 senators, so we'll just say that at most one can be a man, and done. So that was in 2018. So we're through a full 6-year Senate cycle, and still no quotas. Okay. So what do we do until then? So I want to circle back to the data I showed you at the very beginning. So here on my horizontal axis, I have my different groups, from white men to Hispanic women. On my vertical axis, I have the marginal effect of encouragement to run for office. So how much more likely are you to run for office if encouraged, in this case, by a political actor? What you can see is that across most groups, people are much more likely to say that they've thought about running for office if they've received encouragement. Yet we also know that men are much more likely to report receiving encouragement than women. So here on the vertical axis, I'm predicting the number of people who have encouraged you to run. And men, and particularly white men, report having significantly more encouragement from various sources than women. So what we know is that men receive encouragement to run even though they need it less. Women receive less encouragement to run even though encouragement helps to close the ambition gap. And so when women are encouraged, they express ambition at nearly equal rates to men. So what do? So first, we encourage women to run for office. And second, we encourage political parties to recruit women candidates. We'll say that's especially important for the Republican Party, where the gender gap is much more pronounced in women's representation. But encouragement without access to resources is simply not good enough. We know that women have fewer of the resources that they need to run for office. They have less disposable income. They are not plugged into the same networks. They have less free time. They have a higher mental load. The list goes on. Right? And women face higher barriers when running for and holding political office. And so what we need to do is not just encourage women to run, but provide women with the training and the support that they need to be successful, and perhaps most importantly, to keep dismantling the barriers to women's access to power. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions now, and also I'll be around afterwards, and I'm delighted to chat with all of you at the reception. Abdul and Sarah from the Dean's office have microphones, so if you have a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand.
Diana, wonderful, inspiring, scary talk. Do you have a sense of what has been effective in other countries that have allowed them to put in place the kinds of quotas that have made real differences in women's representation?
Yeah, the principal barrier, I think, to quotas in the United States is not even our electoral system, though that makes it hard, right? We have single-member districts, right? So we have one representative from the district, and so that means it's harder to share, right? It's not like we can say, okay, like a man will go Monday, Wednesday, Friday, a woman will go Tuesday, Thursday, whereas in other countries, there are multiple representatives per district. More than that, I think the barrier in the United States, which makes us unique, is primaries. So in order to enact quotas here, we're gonna have to take some control over candidate selection from party activists who are primary voters, and so I think that is the principal barrier. There are places we can look to Mexico sometimes uses primaries and also has obviously very strong quotas for women. And the way those countries have done that is actually beginning with quotas that are weaker, right? So not 50% quotas, but 30% quotas or 25% quotas. Quotas that have fewer sanctions for non-compliance. And then kind of once we start down the process of making people feel comfortable with the Q word, quota, right? We're able to strengthen those policies over time.
Thank you. It's great information. My name is Darcella. So a quick question. I want to add one more to your why women don't run. For me personally, because I don't think I have the temperament for it. You get in between me and my kids and you're gone. So there's a whole thing. But I do think I'm qualified, and I always have. My question for you is when I talk to particularly my men and women friends about women in politics, there is this visceral, oh my God, she's going to get us into a war. And when I say, well, in 248 years, we've been in war for 228, how many of those have been women? Well, the answer is none of course not. So have you found any, just outright, oh my God, that menstrual cycle is going to take her into a whole other world, no matter what level, whether it's mayor to president?
So on the conflict piece, there's actually a fairly significant body of literature on are women leaders more hawkish, right? Both to get there, do you have to be more hawkish, and are you more likely to get goaded by opponents? Very inspired by Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, right? It's very motivated, this entire body of literature. But what we know now, just empirically, is that in democracies with reasonably high levels of gender equality, women are no more or less likely to get into conflicts than men when they're leaders. Obviously, we don't have a whole lot of women leaders to generalize from, but I feel pretty confident about that. I don't have the data for this, but it's interesting in this current moment to look at political candidates and say that it's the woman that doesn't have the temperament for it, right? That it's the woman who is overly emotional or prone to getting led astray or brought off topic. Empirically, that doesn't seem to be borne out at the present. So I think that you got to ask those people for their data, right? Because they don't have it.
Thank you so much. There has been in recent years a pretty dramatic divergence between young men and young women
Yes.
in almost every developed economy except for the US, I think, and starting to appear in the US, including in lots of countries that are still having increased women's representation. Do you think that is going, what are the long-term impacts you think that's going to have for women's political representation?
Good, I love this question, and it's such a smart question because, of course, we think presently a lot in the US about how young women, in particular, are much more left-leaning than other groups, right? So they're more left-leaning than young men, but also than older women. So there's this shift, and we have all these US-centric explanations for this, right? This is why this is a US phenomenon, and then you're a comparative politics scholar like me, and you're like, yeah, no, actually this is happening all over the world, right? So if you want to come study this with me, that would be amazing. There's not great empirical work on this. If we think about what is the global phenomenon that's doing this work, it is the case that these young women are socialized post-Me Too, right? And Me Too, we could argue, is a global phenomenon. I suspect, this is a hypothesis, it's testable, but I haven't tested it, that we're in an unusual moment where young women are looking around and they have made real inroads in higher education, for example, and some inroads in politics, but not a lot. Men still dominate politics. And so that's shifting those women to the left. And also young men are looking around and they are seeing that the space looks different than it did for older men, right? So we're in a push and pull where young women are seeing that there are still these real barriers to women's representation, and men are seeing that things are not going to be as they were before. And so I think we could test that, and I think that actually gender is going to be much more salient for thinking about voter behavior moving forward than it has been historically. So I think that's a great question.
Thank you so much. So I'm wondering how you talk about just the fundamental question around essentialist constructs of womanhood and when it doesn't make a difference. So when I look at your chart, like, so you make the case about tariffs, but I can look at those countries and think about contexts in which the proportional representation doesn't mean that rights for women or certain kinds of aspects that we understand as improving women's lives are better in those contexts. So in contexts like, is there less sexual violence, access to childcare, abortion access, and we can also see in this country, there are many people that we currently have in office who identify as women, who I would say don't necessarily support policies that are supportive of equality for women, right? So what's the conceptual framework to talk about when women actually make a difference when they're in office, and perhaps what are markers to say that they won't make a difference?
Yeah, a Rebecca question's always such a good question. Okay, so I'm thinking about this. So first, absolutely. Like, and this is not a talk that is as intersectional as it kind of could be. So it is the case that intersectional identities really matter. So like, Black women face unique policy challenges and Black women politicians are the strongest advocates on their behalf. So representation matters intersectionally, right? We could also, this is a talk that's really kind of in the binary a little bit, right? But we could also think about this for non-binary people as well. So like, intersectional representation is profoundly important. And for example, in the US, white women are represented in the Democratic Party, like among candidates, about in proportion to our presence in the population, less so in the Republican Party. And it's like men and women of color that are underrepresented in the candidacies of both the Democratic, but especially the Republican Party. So it's a very intersectional question. So then, and this is a bigger question about what it means to represent women. Women often do the work on behalf of women on both sides of this, right? This is the challenge, right? Women contain multitudes. And so, for example, if we look at legislating on abortion within US states, it is liberal Democratic women who do the work to introduce legislation to protect abortion rights. And it is conservative Republican women who do the work to restrict access to abortion and reproductive rights. And those women say that they're representing their women constituents, right? They're doing that work as women. And so then you're, like, it's tricky, right? So you don't want to say you have false consciousness, right? But not all women are feminist women. And non-feminist women, when they get into elected office, do non-feminist things. And the last thing I'll say is if we look cross-nationally, it's like the best predictor of doing work on these issues is identifying as a feminist. So women are much more likely to identify as feminists than men, but men feminists are more likely to do work on gender equality issues than women non-feminists.
Maybe we'll take this one and maybe the one in the middle, and that'll be it.
So I would like to go back to where you started with us, and that is, how do we physically represent who should be an elected representative at what level? And you showed us the slides of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and you talked about the fact that we grow up in our history classes seeing those men, right? So my thought is, and it kind of goes back to a question this gentleman asked you earlier about where men are seeing themselves today, particularly young men. Would it not be a good idea to go into our elementary schools and talk to our children to say, these are the people who did this then, but today we need you to take on these positions, so that we're actually educating our children to know that it is not a male-centric position to serve our country, and it's really a service that we're talking about. So we want young girls and young boys to think I could serve my country, and it's not an issue of male, female, but they see it in an equal way. So I'm encouraging you and others in political science and history to think about where do we go into the classroom and how do we talk to young children about this, so then perhaps we don't have to worry about a quota, we're establishing a quota.
I will put in this Dropbox, which has all the work cited in the slides, a piece that is not mine, but is by some friends that I very much admire, that is about precisely this question of political socialization and political gendered socialization among elementary schoolers. It starts very early. So when we talk to very young children, we're having them draw pictures of politicians because they're not yet literate, right? At a very young age, they're more gender equal, and even through elementary school, this gendered political socialization starts to begin. So yeah, it's absolutely imperative to start then. That being said, so I'm all for that. I'm kind of ride or die for quotas. I know it's like not gonna happen, but like really what we have seen globally, I have to say, Egypt, 80% of Egyptian respondents said they agree or strongly agree that men make better political leaders than women. Egypt elects more women to its legislature than we do. That's like a function of the gender quota. And so like really the fix is elite demand. You just say you have to elect women, as when it turns out that you have to elect women, lo and behold, you're able to find some qualified women for the job. So I know that quotas in the US is just the most uphill battle that I could choose. I'll be talking about it at my retirement speech, I think, right? But still, like I would still advocate for that.
One last question, or
Last question.
okay.
Hi there, thank you so much. So I kind of thought about this more on a global scale. So I know Mexico has a newly elected female president.
Yes.
So considering internal and external factors like culture and religion, do you think women can be more empowered to run for these offices at like a top position in politics? Or do you think we should start like maybe at a local scale?
Oh, I think we should start everywhere. I think women should be running for school board and city council and mayor and the state house and Congress and the president. Like I think we do it all at once right now. So with that, thank you.
So I often tell people that not only arts and sciences, not only does arts and sciences have some of the brilliant scholars, we have some of the best teachers who are also deeply committed to the community and the betterment of the world. And I'm sure that you all agree with me that Diana represents arts and sciences incredibly well in all three dimensions. Thank you so much, Diana, for this inspiring, thoughtful, insightful, thought-provoking. I can use a whole bunch of other adjectives to say, truly, it's just a wonderful presentation, and you probably put together 50 publications in an hour's presentation in such a lucid way. I truly appreciate that. I want to also thank all of you for joining us in the room today, and I know that we have 150 people signing up for the live stream presentation as well. So thank you all so much, and now please join me out there for the reception. Thanks again.